Hi folks, happy Module 3. This week we're talking about planning for teaching. Now this was an interesting one to explain to my friends. When they asked what I was up to this week, I got to tell them that I was planning to teach about planning to teach. This week our required resources were an article called Applying Learning Theories and Instructional Design Models for Effective Instruction, and a video by Ottawa's very own Dr. Posner. I really enjoyed Dr. Posner's video on in situ training for Ebola. As an educator, I found it really interesting listening to Dr. Posner narrating some of the things he had to consider as an educator while he was planning this. Or as he describes it, the where, when, who, and what of in situ simulation. This week's article provides an interesting overview of instructional design. I really like this one because it's very explicit in how learning theories are linked to instructional design. Now, the theories described here are informed by cognitive psychology, so depending on your teaching philosophy, you may understand teaching and learning, or the science of teaching, a little differently than how it is presented here. And that's okay. A really important message in this article is that different domains of learning or knowledge will require different teaching strategies and assessment methods. So as educators, we can't just pick one teaching strategy we really like to teach everything. The article also provides an introduction to 3 different instructional design models. Closer to the end, the authors talk about learning objectives. And as the authors point out, learning objectives are really important. This is partially because they let students know what is expected of them, but they're also really important to educators because they help us decide how to teach the content, as well as how we're going to assess our learners. They mention using measurable verbs, and they include Bloom's taxonomy in Figure 4. They also link learning objectives to selecting our teaching strategies and assessment methods. I thought this warranted talking about a bit more since this is pretty important stuff. So the taxonomy of educational objectives, or Bloom's taxonomy, is a framework for classifying statements of what we expect or intend students to learn as a result of our instruction. The taxonomy was first published in 1956, although work commenced on it in 1949. It was initially created so faculty at various universities could exchange test items. The taxonomy would allow them to create banks of items, with each measuring the same educational objective. This initiative was led by Benjamin Bloom, hence Bloom's taxonomy, and he hoped that this would reduce the labor of preparing annual comprehensive exams. This taxonomy was updated in 2001, and this revised version is what you saw in your reading. Now, our instructional design article was quite right in their brief description of creating learning objectives in that you need measurable verbs. So there's really 2 parts to a learning objective, the noun or the content, and the verb. These represent 2 different dimensions, the knowledge dimension and the cognitive process dimension. There are 4 types of knowledge in the knowledge dimension: factual knowledge, like terminology and other basic elements that a learner needs to know to solve a problem in that discipline; conceptual knowledge, which is the interrelationship among those basic elements within a larger structure that enables them to function together. So this would be classifications, general principles, theories, models, things of that nature. Procedural knowledge, or how to do something, and metacognitive knowledge, which is knowledge about cognition in general, as well as awareness of and knowledge about one's own cognition. The cognitive process dimension is what I think most people think of when they think of Bloom's taxonomy. In the original 1956 version, there were 6 categories in the cognitive dimension: knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. These were ordered from simple to complex, concrete to abstract. In the original version, these categories were seen as being a cumulative hierarchy, so you had to master the simpler categories before mastering the more complex ones. While the revised taxonomy still sees these cognitive processes as differing in complexity, it isn't such a strict hierarchy anymore. Like the original version, the revised version has 6 categories. However, they're a little different. They are remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. There's also a number of subcategories within these. So in the revised version, they renamed 3 of the categories and interchanged the order of 2. They've also changed the names so all of the categories are verbs. You can put the knowledge and cognitive processes dimensions together in a taxonomy table to get a quick visual indication of the extent to which more complex kinds of knowledge and cognitive processes are involved in your teaching. You can see here that the knowledge dimension is on the vertical axis and the cognitive process is on the horizontal. The objective is placed in the cell where the two meet. Now, as I alluded to earlier, we can use our learning objectives to help us select teaching strategies and appropriate methods of assessment. We can do this by looking at the type of knowledge we want to teach, as well as the cognitive process dimension. For example, problem-based learning is a great strategy for some of the more cognitively complex objectives. In Effective Teaching, a guide for educating healthcare providers, the authors provide us with some questions we would want to ask ourselves as educators here. First, is the method appropriate for the learning objective? So the authors give us the example of teaching students how to give an injection. In this case, we shouldn't just give a lecture. Students should also have an opportunity to practice the skill. Second, we want to ask, are the resources that this method requires available? And similarly, are special facilities required? For example, do you need access to a computer lab, to a sim lab? What is the projected size of the class? Is a special room arrangement needed for this method? And is it actually possible in this room? For example, it's really hard to work in small groups when you're teaching in a lecture hall where the chairs and the tables are bolted to the ground. And will the method selected stimulate interest and provide variety? Make sure you're changing up your teaching strategy to keep things fresh. Now, if you'll think back to the Ebola simulation video, I have a few questions for you to reflect on. You may want to discuss these with your group this week. What types of knowledge do you think were being covered in the Ebola in situ simulation? Which cognitive processes were being targeted by Dr. Posner? And what are some examples of learning objectives for this simulation? And that's all for now, folks. And as always, I will see you all online.